Hi, I want to welcome everybody who's joining us on Zoom and welcome everybody who's here in person. I'm Joshua Tucker. I'm the director of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia. As with all of our programming that we're doing it now, we know we're doing it in the shadow of horrendous events that are taking place following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And, all of us here at the Jordan Center, we stand with everyone in Ukraine and Russia and the rest of the world who opposes this senseless and brutal war. Within that context, though, what we as scholars can try to do in these times is to continue to put high quality information into the information ecosystem. And so at the Jordan Center, we are very welcome to have another quite relevant topic here today that we're going to be talking about. We want to thank all of you for joining us here today. I'm going to introduce my colleague, Elliot Borenstein, who is one of our faculty associates at the Jordan Center. And Elliot is going to introduce our speaker today. So Elliot, come on. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Josh. I'm Elliot Borenstein, professor of Russian and Slavic Studies, and I've been working at the Jordan Center since it started. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Vladislav Davidzon, who is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council Eurasia Center, which is based in France. He is European cultural correspondent for Tablet magazine, and he founded the Odessa Review and served as its chief editor until July 2018. He is the author of From Odessa with Love, right here. His work has been featured in numerous publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Book Forum, World Policy Journal, the New York Observer, and American Interest. Davidzon holds a master's degree in human rights and democratization from the European Inter-University Center for Human Rights in Italy, and earned his bachelor's degree at the City University of New York. And on top of all of that, I have to say, every time I feel like I'm really busy, I think about what Vlad has been doing this past 2 months, which involved going to 8 different countries, helping family members get out of Ukraine, reporting from war zones, and so on and so forth. And I stopped complaining. And I'm really glad that he was able to take time out from his literally really busy schedule to come here and speak with us. The topic of his talk today is the birth of a Ukrainian political nation and President Zelensky as Ukrainian Jew and statesman. So welcome, Vladislav.
Thank you, Professor Borenstein. I'm really, truly grateful to be invited to NYU by a scholar and a pal of your stature, your accomplishment, and a scholar whose books I've read with tremendous interest and graciousness, and I've learned a lot from. The only funny thing is as having been away from New York for a year, I was not prepared for the mask policy, which I understand and respect, but I hope you can hear me, is all I'm saying. So I have just returned from the Ukrainian-Polish border. The events of the last 48 hours in Bucha and Irpin, the events of today in the United Nations, I think today's the 5th, right? April 5th, just so we date this for history's sake. We are really in the midst of world historical changes. We're in the midst of transfiguration of European American politics vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis Moscow. And because of this large amount of war crimes that are obviously committed in Bucha and Irpin, that we're just finding out about, the most horrific things over the last 48 hours. The entire talk that I wrote until now has been superseded by events. This talk is about the consolidation of a Ukrainian political nation. This talk was supposed to be about President Zelensky. We all know a world historical figure, a man thrust into the bosom of destiny who really got what he was supposed to do and has done it tremendously. This talk is supposed to be was supposed to be about my forthcoming book, which is out in a month. It's called Jewish-Ukrainian Relations and the Birth of a Political Nation. I've been studying the Ukrainian-Jewish relationship and the relationship of the Ukrainians to ethnic minorities in Ukraine for a very long time. This book is an outcome of 8 years of my labor, and in some ways half the pieces in it have been superseded by events, but in other ways, it is incredibly timely, as the Ukrainian political nation is being born, was already born in 2014, but it is being supercharged in real time. The events of the last 48 hours, in terms of what we're finding out, is happening from my friends and colleagues on the ground, will be seen by future historians as a game changer politically, in the same way that the shooting down of MH17 in the June of 2014 really reconstructed the way European elites and European audiences looked at the conflict 8 years ago. So I have inklings, I have thoughts, I have intimations, I have theories, I have impulses, I have certain emotions about what has been happening in the last 48 hours, but I cannot say that I've thought them through in terms of what is going to happen vis-a-vis Russian-Ukrainian relations in the construction of Ukrainian political state. Just over the last 2 days, I've seen numerous posts from my friends in Ukraine all over social media saying they're not going to be speaking Russian anymore. Obviously, just an hour ago, President Zelensky spoke at the United Nations, basically calling it out League of Nations style, saying, as long as the Russians are on the Security Council covering for the crimes that they're committing in my country, this institution has no legitimacy. So literally an hour and a half ago, President Zelensky said that the United Nations can go in the dustbin of history if they don't do something about what he saw yesterday in Bucha and Irpin when he visited. So I have no predictions about what's going to happen in terms of Russian-Ukrainian relations, other than the fact that they're going to be even worse than they were over the last month, simply because I got on a plane to come here and I learned about the deaths of 2 more of my acquaintances as I got on the plane. And I've not processed that, and I've not yet processed what the last 2 days are going to do in terms of a consolidation of Ukrainian state. Obviously, it's going to become a lot more consolidated. So this piece, this essay, parts of which I'm going to read, is going to appear in my next book. It first appeared in Tablet magazine exactly a month ago. I'm going to read parts of it and some additions to it. This is a piece called Jewish Ukrainian Fights Nazi Russia. As always, writers don't come up with titles. Don't write me, write the editors. This is a piece about the historical absurdities of the Ukrainian political nation as they're embodied by President Zelensky. Absurdities which point us to deeper truths about Ukraine's messy identity and its self-construction as a political nation in the midst of its war, which is on its 41st or 42nd day, or its 39th day, depending on how you count. So, when Vladimir Putin launched this war of aggression and choice, he had expected a quick collapse of Ukrainian armed forces. And that young, unserious Zelensky would either capitulate or flee. But Zelensky had not only stood his ground under pressure, he also routed the Ukrainian political nation, a nation he is helping to consolidate and solidify, even as Putin seeks to destroy it in a totally unpredictable manner. It is now functionally impossible for the Russian army to deliver the decapitating strike that Putin ordered against the government without turning Zelensky into a world historical martyr and an independent Ukraine into an immortal idea. Okay. Whatever happens now, Zelensky, whether he wins or extends the war or loses this war, or is finally taken out by enraged Putin, who unlike him wouldn't dream of visiting his troops in their tents or sharing in their danger, he will be remembered as a hero of liberty and democracy in the West, perhaps the most consequential one since the end of the Cold War. Already I look forward to taking my grandchildren to visit the statues to him that will one day be erected to wherever Ukrainians celebrate their survival and freedom. It is thanks to Zelensky that I have some hope, some small measure of hope that I will get to visit them in Kiev, Kherson, Kharkiv, and Odessa, not only in Toronto, Chicago, Tel Aviv, and Warsaw. Zelensky is a master communicator, and his speeches have been pitch perfect. He has, after all, practiced for this role his entire life. There's no doubt in my mind that the Ukrainian army has held and fought as ferociously as it has because of the confidence and conviction that Zelensky has been able to instill in them through his words and actions. Given a choice to evacuate the country by the Biden administration, Zelensky famously reposted that he needed ammunition and not a ride. The Klitschko brothers, both heavyweight boxing champions, one of whom is the mayor of Kiev and is currently leading its militias and territorial defense forces with the moxie and intensity of an avenging angel, is of partial Jewish descent, or of partial Jewish descent. It is surely no accident, comrades, that the neo-Nazi Ukraine that Putin desires to subjugate and cleanse for the sin of resisting his embrace is led in battle by a president, a minister of defense, a chief of administration, and a mayor of Kiev, who all have some Jewish blood and roots, all of which signals the ratification of a country that does not look back to any hoary, full conception of Ukrainian political ethos, but rather to the internationalism, cosmopolitanism, and historicity of a particular Ukraine as it has been and is in reality. This modern version of Ukraine has won, regardless of the destruction that the superior weaponry of a demoralized and disorganized Russian army inflicts on it. And as we've been learning, the horrors in Irpin, in Mariupol, in Bucha, and Bogdarivka are horrific. We've all been seeing these horrific videos, horrific photos all over social media, and you don't need to know more about it. You could just look online. It is proving so with a heroism much more universal than a doomed and narrowly anti-imperialist heroism of a Khmelnytsky or a Petlura. Now, I know purists will say that Khmelnytsky was a Orthodox nationalist, and Petlura did have cosmopolitan roots, and his government did have Jews in it. But nonetheless, I see them as representatives of a particularly Ukrainian Ukraine. You know, Khmelnytsky did become a Orthodox Russian nationalist, sold out, whatever. Anyways, this is academia. I thought I'd give a footnote, which I don't usually get to do, being a journalist. Zelensky, who like me speaks Russian at home to his parents and his wife, also represents a Ukrainian political nationality that is anti-Russian in a political sense, as opposed to just the self-pitying accusations of Russophobia, which are bandied about by the Kremlin. He represents the opposite of a Russian notion of establishing an order in a multi-ethnic state by centralizing authority with unbending force. Zelensky's Ukraine is now embracing a loyalty to the nation that implies the acceptance and transcendence of difference, rather than oppression or elimination of difference. That is how and why it can be led by Ukrainians of Jewish descent, why it has proved so intoxicating to West that currently seems to lack such qualities of confidence and self-cohesion and simple virtues such as resilience, piety, and valor. Incidentally, more about the consolidation of the Ukrainian state in a civic as opposed to an ethnic nationalist conception. Incidentally, speaking recently on the evening news, the Mufti of the Ukrainian Muslim community, Said Ismailov, appeared straight out of central casting in a flowery black robe embroidered with golden flowers, a white turban, and steel-rimmed glasses. He made such a stirring defense of the loyalty of Ukrainian Muslims to the Ukrainian state that he brought the newscaster who was interviewing him to tears. Zelensky, the one time I discussed this issue with him over dinner, I've only met Zelensky personally once. We had dinner the night before he became president, me, him, and two other people. Although I've met him at pressers and shook his hand, my personal relationship with him was 1 3-hour dinner. I got a sense of him. I didn't know I was having dinner with Churchill at the time. Zelensky has never seemed to me, including the one time that I discussed this issue with him, to be particularly comfortable with deploying or inhabiting his Jewish background in public. Despite the fact that Ukrainians enjoy pointing out his national success as an indication of a lack of anti-Semitism in the country, organized anti-Semitism, and the fact that his Jewishness was not a liability during the 2019 presidential campaign, it felt to me like his uncertainty about his identity would prove an awkward and evident tension. And ironically, this is very Ukrainian, the anti-Semitism that was deployed during the campaign was deployed by Ukrainian nationalists who were allied with the Jewish candidate against Poroshenko, who was saying that he was a Jew. There's a conspiracy theory, unproven, that President Poroshenko is of Jewish descent. So ironically, in 2019, was the only anti-Semitism was pushed towards President Poroshenko, not towards the Jewish candidate, which is hilarious and also very Ukrainian, right? So it felt to me like his uncertainty about his identity would prove an awkward and evident tension. He only leaned into his identity as a Jew, as a post-Soviet Jew, in the midst of this war, right? He used the tropes of historical Jewish memory and the Holocaust in speaking to Americans, to Israelis, and to Germans. Before that, it was certainly something that he knew about himself, and it was something that he joked about, but it wasn't something that he felt very seriously comfortable with discussing in the public sphere. But now here he is, effortlessly deploying it for the greater good of the state. Zelensky is doubling down on his Jewish heritage at the same time that he represents a sort of postmodern version of Pinocchio. He stepped out of the television set into the real world, into politics, and he became a real boy and eventually a man. Cometh the hour, cometh the man. Zelensky received a staggering 73% of the vote in the second round of the election in 2019. At the time, many outside analysts and observers viewed that tally as a manifestation of the capacity of television to create an illusory reality. In this case, a modern populist communicator naming an actual political party after his own TV show. The heroism that Zelensky demonstrated in the past few weeks is a reflection of the resilience, cohesion in times of crisis, and other traits of the ordinary Ukrainian. Back in the comparatively peaceful days of 2019, 3/4 of the population of Ukraine took one look at Zelensky and realized that he was one of them. Through some sort of heuristic that I can neither understand nor describe, they saw a manifestation of their best qualities. And you know what? They were right. What is democracy if not that? Over dinner the night before his election, I impertinently joked to Zelensky that he would have to improve his English if he was to become a real Davos man. Actually, to tell him, you're going to have to improve your English if you're going to become Davos man. The joke is very much on me, and shame on me, and on all of us. Glory to Ukraine and glory to Zelensky, the bravest Jew on earth. So that is a piece from my forthcoming book. I'm going to jettison the rest of my talk because it has become overshadowed by events over the last 2 days, as we see the Russian state retreating and everything that we were told by American intelligence services about so-called killists and the destruction of the Ukrainian intelligentsia and former soldiers and mayors and security officials as being totally true. In fact, I was told on the night that I was leaving the night I left Kiev on the 24th of February. I didn't want to be surrounded by Russian troops. Being a Russian citizen, I wanted to report from behind Ukrainian lines. I didn't want to be safe, but I didn't want to be encircled by Russians. I was told by numerous people that it would be very bad for me if I got picked up in a filtration system. I am a member of Atlantic Council. I was a board member of 2 organizations which are on Russian government watch lists. I was told not to get picked up by Russian troops, even just for ID checks. So I wanted to report behind Russian lines. So I kept moving around to outflank the Russians as I was reporting. I went to the Belarus border. I went from the Belarus border to Ternopil, from Ternopil to Rovne, from Rovne to the Kiev region, down around to Bielotserkov, up to Bucha, came back from Bucha to Rovne again, went down Chernowitz. On March 8th, on my birthday, I actually wound up sitting in a Romanian refugee camp waiting for my papers to get checked so that I could get my relatives from Odessa out into France. My wife called me and said, you have to stop being a reporter, you have to start being a refugee and start helping get refugees out. I helped various people that I know get out. And importantly, I lost a week of reporting because I had to help my own relatives get out. It was rather something that one has to do. One cannot not get one's relatives out of a war zone, but also I would have preferred to have been reporting. This is not to be complaining to my wife again on live television. I've done this before. My apologies. But just to say, on March 8th, I left the Ukrainian-Romanian border into from Chernowitz into Romania, went into Moldova, picked up my relatives. None of them had passports. They were little girls. They didn't have passports. They'd never been on an airplane before, so they couldn't get into France. I had to go to Bucharest to the French embassy and to get them laissez-passez. I got them laissez-passez after 3 days of bureaucratic maneuvering in Bucharest. I flew my family to France. I had 3 days of R&R. I went to London. I came back, gave a talk, and flew to Poland for the Biden visit. I was there during Biden visit, and then I went back into Lviv to report, and then came out again, came back to France, and flew here. Some other stuff happened in between. It's been a very eventful month. So maybe if we just, instead of my talking about conceptual things, we just have an informal conversation about what's going on. People want to ask me questions about the consolidation of the Ukrainian political state over the last month, how things are going to pan out, arms deals, weapons deals. No questions about Sean Penn, please. I signed an NDA. That's on Twitter. Just Google around if you're interested. I saw the Polish Prime Minister a week ago in Warsaw. I saw the Defense Minister of Ukraine a week ago in Warsaw. If you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Wonderful, thank you so much. This was really fascinating. I think for so many of us, just hearing anything at all from someone who's been there, especially someone as well informed as you, is really really useful. But I agree, opening this up for a conversation is probably one of the best things we can do right now.
Yeah.
So if anyone would like to ask a question, well, I'll start with a question and what people are thinking.
Sure.
I'll start with a question that people ask me, but I never have an answer to, because of course, how could anyone have an answer to it? But you know, you're here, so I'll try it on you. What do you think is going to happen next?
Okay. All right. Great. Okay. A military strategy question. Okay.
Or diplomacy question, or
Diplomacy question. Okay. Those are different questions. On diplomacy, the Ukrainians are making some concessions. Diplomacy, I think, has gone further than people think, but also has not gone anywhere far enough. The Russians have not achieved any of their objectives. They've not even finalized taking Mariupol, so they're not going to be signing a deal yet, although they will have to, and they're not going to be able to achieve their primary objective, certainly not. There's very little trust in between the diplomatic teams. There's been so much chicanery and so much political intrigue around the diplomatic process. It's hard to keep track of how cunning some of the things are. There have been instances, accusations of poisoning. There have been members of the Ukrainian delegation who wound up suspiciously dead. I don't know if anyone knows about this. So one of the members of the Ukrainian delegation was shot, and then the Ukrainian intelligence services reported him to be a posthumous hero. What's that about? Various Russian oligarchs are engaged in back-channel diplomacy. Various billionaires whose names should not be mentioned are engaged in back-channel diplomacy. We're at the point now where the negotiations locations are picked partly by both sides, certainly by the Ukrainian side, based on being able to know that they're not going to be poisoned. There's not going to be, as far as I know, any more negotiations in Belarus after what's been happening. The original cycle of negotiations in Belarus, the Ukrainians really had to be coaxed into going there because they thought they would get killed. I mean, they really had to be given a lot of back channel concessions in order to go there. Even just to go there, the defense minister was not, the bulk of the presidential administration was not happy about having to go there. They did eventually, and also the Lukashenko is, of course, a party to the conflict, one way or the other. Although the Belarus army has not yet fully gone in for all sorts of reasons, and I don't think it's going to at this point. I don't think he would survive that happening if it did. But the negotiations are coming along. There are things that I should not talk about publicly. There are there are issues that the Ukrainian population will need to be prepared for extensively by the Ukrainian political leadership. One of the big problems that the Zelensky administration will have is that they're going to have a population which is so enraged and so full of understandable hatred towards Russians after what they've been seeing the last 48 hours and last month, that it's going to be very difficult in order to get them to get certain concessions. The Russian government threw away their moral, political, economic legitimacy on this war. They went all in, and they have a lot of leverage, having gone all in with their entire political economy, with everything that they threw away, including becoming a North Korea. So the Ukrainians are not going to get back all the land, certainly not for a while, and they're going to have to make. And I'm not saying this prescriptively. I'm saying this descriptively as an analyst. I'm absolutely Ukrainian patriot, but they're going to be made to make certain unpalatable decisions, which may or may not affect the capacity of a sovereignty of a state. I'm not saying that they should, and I'm neither am I a former or current ambassador or diplomat or someone in negotiations. I speak for myself and as an analyst and as a journalist, as opposed to someone involved in negotiations or telling the Ukrainians what to do. Please don't call me or the Atlantic Council saying that I'm a defeatist. I'm not. But with the amount of troops that the Russians still have in Donbass, and they've lost now the Battle of Kiev very badly, and they've thrown all those troops around into Belarus, and we're going to regroup them in Donbass. It's going to be a very messy, very vicious war for a long time. Zelensky just said that it would take 40 to 50,000 deaths of his best troops in order to retake the Donbass, obviously signaling that the Ukrainian army doesn't have the capacity for a counteroffensive. The conversation now, and it's been completely torqued in Brussels and London and Washington, D.C. by what we're seeing over the last 48 hours, is about getting offensive weapons to the Ukrainians. There has been a unnecessary division in terms of conceptualization of weaponry that the Biden administration and the Europeans are giving to the Ukrainians. They're referring to offensive as opposed to defensive weaponry. They do not want to give the highest caliber weapons, the tanks, planes to the Ukrainians. There are many reasons why this is so. I'm not going to be talking so much about it, but obviously I'm not interested in criticizing the Europeans or the Biden administration. It's very delicate. Obviously, there is a great deal of back-channel negotiations. There is a bipartisan consensus in Congress on the fact that those weapons will be given. The Sullivan's team and the State Department and the NAC are having very technical negotiations about what to give and what not to give. Those conversations are really interesting. There's a lot happening. The British are pushing on some of it. The Europeans are being pushed by the Poles, by the Lithuanians. Basically, in the next week and a half, there's going to be a breakthrough on offensive weaponry. I don't think on planes yet. The war is going to go on for weeks, maybe months. I don't see an armistice happening anytime soon. The Russians are going to try to surround the Ukrainian army in the JTO. That's about a quarter of the Ukrainian fighting force, including their 10 best battalions, well, seasoned battalions, are in the Donbass. I don't see Syrian-style situation yet. We could go that way, but I don't see it yet. So that's kind of a messy response, but there's just a lot there.
Great. We have a couple questions in the chat now.
Mm-hmm.
One from Danny Steinmetz. This is awkward but necessary. In light of all the Russian atrocities, it would be surprising if there aren't some revenge atrocities by Ukrainians,
Sure.
especially soldiers whose family or friends were abused or murdered. What do you know about how the Ukrainian government will respond?
That's a great question. I mean, the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian government understand full well that the only thing that they really have in this conflict is their honor and their moral force and their moral legitimacy and the fact that they're underdogs and they're fighting for the good. Clearly, the Ukrainian army has given all sorts of orders to the Ukrainians not to engage in retaliatory killings towards Russian POWs. A lot of it is difficult to control because a lot of those guys are in territorial defense battalions. A lot of those guys basically, in some sectors, I imagine, do what they want. I imagine the control of Kiev on some sectors, especially when guys get cut off from the front, is not so serious. In certain instances, clearly there will be Ukrainian servicemen who will take revenge killings. It's a very sad thing. This is war. Certainly, there's a hierarchy of moral legitimacy and crime, even within war crimes. Castrating or killing, and there has been a lot of this stuff, a prisoner of war who had just been shooting at you. It's not the same thing as breaking into someone's house, killing them, having their way with their wife, killing her in front of her 4-year-old daughter and taking their gold. Those are not, morally speaking, if we're going to speak about just war theory, those are not, and even certainly about human rights law, those are not equal levels of war crimes in terms of our moral intuitions, even though they're both war crimes and both perpetrators should be punished for them. The rage is intense. It is palpable. There's going to be a lot more of it. There's going to be horrific incidents. We're going to find out some very, very, very nasty things. I do not condone any of these things. I expect them to happen, and I do not condone them, but that is not what the Ukrainian army has told Ukrainian soldiers to do, and it would be good for everybody, and it would be good for Ukraine's international legitimacy if these incidents do come to light, that perpetrators are prosecuted, historically, especially with sex crimes, sexual assault committed by Ukrainian soldiers and volunteers in the Donbass. There has been impudence, and there has been a lack of convictions that the Ukrainian state could do better on and should do better on. So I don't expect them to be really great on this in the middle of a war. Again, without condoning any of this, I'm saying as an analyst, please don't write me or the Atlantic Council. But I'm condoning war crimes. But I think you know where I'm going with this, right?
Yeah, sure. Another question from Dominique Hoffman. Can you speak to the consolidation of Ukrainian identity over the last month or 8 years and the challenges of potentially reintegrating Donbass?
Yeah. Look, Donbass isn't going to get reintegrated anytime soon. Let's start with that. Even before this, there were very smart, very serious voices in the English-speaking sphere. Alexander Motul, most conclusively, who said that the Donbass was not reintegratable, that it would break the Ukrainian state, that it did not have enough resources or internal cohesion in order to reintegrate it, and have $50 billion to rebuild it. The resources are even less to be found there. There will be $700 billion to $1 trillion worth of reconstruction needs based on preliminary numbers that I've seen. And basically the international liberal world order is only holding about $300 billion worth of bullion and currency, euros, dollars, pounds, that were frozen from the Russian central bank. So that's only about half to a third of what we're going to need as of now, and the war's not over. I hope that answers the question about Donbass. I mean, that's a hypothetical, and it's just not going to happen, and the Russians are going to fight for it because they have to look like they've won something. I just don't see the Donbass coming back now, and frankly, the resources aren't there, and it's not the first order priority. Although, of course, all Ukrainian territory should be returned, and clearly it's illegally annexed and all this. It's just not going to happen anytime soon. So let's go to the next question. Political identity. The Ukrainians who have died, 3/4 of them, are from Russian-speaking cities. All this stuff about denazification or fighting for the Ruski Mir, the worst part of it I mean, it's all horrible, but possibly, ironically, the most part of it is that the Russians are killing disproportionately Russian speakers. Outside of Kherson, where have they been fighting Ukrainian speakers outside of the army? If they're bombing Mariupol, if they're bombing the suburbs of Kiev, if they're bombing Kharkiv, those are all Russian-speaking towns and cities. Probably 75 to 85% of the people who have been killed so far, and it's probably about 20 to 25,000 civilians and probably 6 to 8,000 Ukrainian troops now, although they don't love talking about their casualties. Some people say 5, some people say 8. It's in that ballpark, probably 1 dead Ukrainian for every 2 dead Russian soldier. 75 to 85% of the casualties so far of all the Ukrainians dead, especially the civilians, are Russian speakers. They're from Kharkiv, they're from Mariupol, they're from surrounding towns, they're not from Ukrainian-speaking towns. It's not in Ivano-Frankivsk that the war is going on. It's not in Chernowitz. It's not in Lviv. It's next to Chernigiv. It's next to the Russian border. It's in Mariupol, which makes the claims of fighting for the so-called Ruski Mir all the more insidious, clearly. So there were many people in those towns who were Russian speakers and who now are livid and do not want to see themselves as Russian speakers anymore. I've seen so many people of my friends, of my acquaintances in the intelligentsia, in the arts world, who have just made commitments to only speaking Ukrainian. People from Russian-speaking families. In a process which I thought would take 15 to 20 years has been speeded up to 15 months, right? Things will be completely different 24 months from now, let alone 15 years from now. Man, let's not make predictions. This is a dirty war and things are going to get out of hand. But the consolidation of Ukrainian political identity, which began at 14 and by 16 was percolating outside of intelligentsia and the middle classes, is now on hyperdrive, right? So that's, you know.
Thank you. Another question from Judith Levitt. How does the history of pogroms post-World War II and the Ukrainian Nazi battalion in World War II fit into the historical basis for the new Ukrainian identity?
Oh, this is so complicated. Okay, so my next book, Jewish-Ukrainian Relations and the Birth of a Political Nation, talks a great deal about historical memory. I really wasn't prepared to talk about this today. I could go on. I have for hours and hours at a time about this. Let me give. And in the middle of a war, you know, in the middle of the worst fighting, I really kind of don't want to go too far in that direction. I think certain things don't need to be said right in the middle of the Battle of Kiev and the Battle of Donetsk, as we're unearthing people who were shot 1937 style in the back of their head, as we're finding thousands of people literally executed in shallow graves because they had been in the army or because they were a mayor or because they were killists. I think even as a Ukrainian Jew and as a Ukrainian Jewish patriot, or as someone who burned their Russian passport in front of the Russian embassy with a camera crew in tow a week and a half ago, I'm leery of making certain kinds of comments in the middle of this. So that said, there are obviously tremendous historical parallels. This entire book that I'm publishing is about World War II memory and the way it was used and misused over the last 8 years by the Kremlin. Obviously, I'm not going to be talking about Azov for a long time. There are lots of people who have done that already. Andres Umlach, who's the editor of this book, is very good on that. I would tell people to look at his writing. Look, I've been writing about that issue for 8 years. I'd like to just, because we're in the middle of a battle, I'd like to skip that one. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah.
There is a question about the other.
Of course.
From Carol, we asked that.
Oh, Carol,
Yes,
of course.
so,
Okay.
so this
My own
question-
fault. I have to do it. Fine. Okay, fine.
It's the right Carol.
Okay.
Carol Fink writes, is this the right Carol? Can you clarify the role of the Azov battalion, which is reportedly present in Mariupol and now in Bucha?
The day before the war started, on the 24th, I had coffee at 7 in the evening with a friend, a Ukrainian Jewish political consultant and PR guy, and he was 3 times an IDP already, and he was from Donetsk. He had to move from Donetsk to Kiev, and he told me, Vlad, the war's going to start tomorrow. I have a really bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. The war was going to start already. I mean, if you had access to military intelligence, you knew that they were going to be bombing at 4 in the morning. But he's like, I have the same exact feeling as I had in the spring of 2014. Something bad's going to happen. I'm taking my kids to Lviv tomorrow. My son is going to be the fourth generation of my family in Ukraine who have to move around because of political violence, the grandfather and the Holocaust and the thing. And I said, you know, you're a Jew from Donetsk and you're a Ukrainian patriot. You know, what do you think about all these right wingers? You know, I know my position. I said to him, what do you think about all these right wingers in Azov fighting the Ruskies? He said to me, so what? Yeah, they're right wing. And I said, you know, there are some pretty blood and soil nationalist types, not all of them, but, you know, a minority of blood and soil nationalist types in a battalion of 2,500 guys who are under the Interior Ministry. He says to me, yeah, there are guys. There's some Nazis, but there are Nazis. Now, look, Azov Battalion is certainly not Nazi. When Beletsky founded it in 2011, it had Nazi roots and it had some pagan roots. There were all sorts of weirdos in there with pagan runes. I've hung out with some Swedish snipers with a lot of runes on them, okay? I've gotten drunk with guys who had a lot of runes on them, all sorts of runes. You know, pagan stuff up all over their chest. There are weirdo Orthodox nationalists. There are pagan guys. There's some guys with all sorts of symbols on them. But it's a non-story. The battalion was integrated into the Interior Ministry, and its officers are mainline officers of the Ukrainian army. The Azov battalion is not ideologically an ultra-right-wing battalion. It's a Ukrainian nationalist battalion. And any good sociologist, political philosopher will tell you that there's no distinction between patriotism and nationalism that anybody has been able to prove, and I believe in that. The patriot, nationalist, jingoist fashion dichotomy stream is, yeah, it exists, but you know, so what? Yeah, the difference between a patriot and a nationalist in the middle of a war is hard to parse. Clearly, Schmidt says we're all nations are always at war, and of course, waving a flag outside of war, some people in advanced liberal democracies think is vulgar, but we are at war, and clearly, it's guys who wave flags very vigorously that are good at killing other guys, and we do need those guys to defend civilians, which is what's happening in Mariupol. Those guys in Azov, some small percentage of whom are not people that I want to socialize with personally, are defending civilians in Mariupol. So I don't really care what kind of tattoos they have, okay? That's my position on Azov. I hope that's useful.
Thank you. Another question from Danny Steinmetz. There is a particularity in the Ukrainian declared Russian losses involving the number of Russian fuel tanker trucks, aka cisterns. They were declared as 60 on February 28th, and that number stayed unchanged for a month. Only in the last week, they gradually moved up to 73. Is it really possible that not a single fuel truck was taken out for almost a month? I would assume that fuel trucks would have been prime targets to hobble Russian Federation logistics.
Yeah. Look, I don't believe anybody's numbers. I mean, we all sit on Twitter all day long watching the Osnet numbers. I look at the numbers that the Ukrainian army gives, and I look at the numbers that people like Michael Kaufman and Rob Lee give. We all look at the Twitter Osnet. We all look at the social media Telegram channels. We all spend our days on Telegram looking at. We've all become military connoisseurs. I didn't even know the difference between a T-72AB and a T-72BA like a month ago. Now suddenly we're all military strategists who know every different structure in the Russian military and how many of which tank has been taken by Ukrainian farmers. So I don't believe any of these numbers. Obviously, the Russians are not reporting their casualty lists and what they've lost, and the Ukrainians are inflating what they've killed of the Russians. Obviously, the Ukrainians have won the military information war and the propaganda war, and we have every video of a blown up Russian tank and none of the videos of blown up Ukrainian tanks. We have a lot of information about what the state of the Russian army. We have almost very little, almost none. I wouldn't say almost none, but we have a very skewed version of what the state of Ukrainian military is. I watch these graphics as much as everybody else, but I don't believe in any of them. So take any estimates of blown up fuel trucks with a grain of salt. And also, it is absolutely the case that the Ukrainians are very clever, and their defense strategy was all about blowing up the logistics and starving the beast, and it worked. And the Russian army is now exhausted, and it's lost its capacity to assault, which is why they pulled out of Kiev and are rearming. Go ahead.
We have a question from the studio audience.
At the beginning of the war, there seemed to be a lot of anger from Ukrainians towards Russians who did not go out into the streets to protest. And then it became apparent that there was a lot of repression, and this was simply impossible to do. Has this anger kind of mellowed a little, or people are getting even more angry with the Russians, and getting the sense that we don't care about you whatsoever, we have our own war, and we don't have any allies on that side?
The latter, the hatred towards Russia has congealed so much that I don't even see exactly what you're saying. In the beginning of the war, we had all these appeals to the Russians, to our Russian friends and the intelligentsia. Now, most of the Ukrainian population has no illusions, or doesn't even think that Russians are capable of doing anything of that sort. I'm seeing so much hatred from my friends, from my acquaintances, on the Telegram channels. The rage that the Ukrainian population is feeling is going to be there for generations. This is generation-long trauma. The Russians, I will not be the first one to tell you that Putin got everything that he was afraid of in terms of polarization of the Ukrainian nation, in terms of pushing away the Ukrainians, in terms of if anyone was going to repress the Russian language in Ukraine, it's going to be now, and understandably so. Of course, not condoning it. Don't write letters. Descriptive, not prescriptive comments. Always descriptive, never prescriptive. So much rage in the social media, in the Telegram, from phone calls, from emails, from my own wife, who's Ukrainian, from a Russian-speaking family. I speak Russian to my wife. We had a conversation now. We had a conversation yesterday, actually, whether my French and Ukrainian are good enough to speak to her at home. And so we're negotiating within my household which language we're going to be speaking, and we're leaning towards English now. But my wife is a native French speaker also. I'm probably not going to start speaking French at home with my wife. That'd be a little silly, speaking my fourth language to my wife at home, but it's not a bad language to speak to your wife, French. Anyways, I'm going off on a tangent, however pleasant, but it's a joke, but I'm not being entirely jocular. There are thousands of Russian families, or tens of thousands, not millions of Russian-speaking families in Ukraine who will be switching to Ukrainian on a political basis because of what they've seen in Bucha and Irpin over the last 2 days.
A question from Michelle Fish. What do you want the American public to understand about this war that the press is not capturing or focusing on sufficiently?
Oh, great. Yeah, it's such a good question. What is there are a lot of good journalists there. A lot of my colleagues are doing good work. Like to think I've done decent work. We're trying to explain to people what the situation is on the ground. The idea that this was earned in some way by Ukrainians. There's a lot of misinformation, especially amongst people on the far right and the far left, that this was somehow deserved, this has something to do with NATO. It's all silly. This is all entirely about Russian imperialism and chauvinism, and a view of the Ukrainians as not a real people, a false view of the Ukrainian political nation as not being real, entirely about old-fashioned chauvinism towards the Ukrainians. The very fact that Putin did this is already an indication of the fact that he had failed using every other tool in the toolkit in order to tinker with Ukrainian politics. And he saw his window within the longue durée of his presidency. He saw the window of being able to do something about the Ukrainians as shortening. So there was less and less Russian support of colonists within the Ukrainian political nation. Remember 2010 elections, between 25% the pro-Russians and 25% communists. Half of the Ukrainian parliament was Russian or pro-Kremlin, not Russian, but pro-Kremlin 12 years ago. Now, at most, the pro-Russian fifth columnists have 10% of parliament, in between Medvedchuk and the other fraction of the opposition bloc. So, in between the Ukrainians moving away from Russia, moving away from economic cord to Russia, moving towards Europe, moving towards European structures, he saw within his sick fantasia of wanting to dominate Ukraine, he saw the window being able to do it closing. So he thought now every moment is better than later. So he went all in, stupidly.
Thank you. Another question from Carol Fink. There is evidence that after the Russian withdrawal, some Ukrainian refugees are now returning to the country. What percentage of the huge exodus do you believe will return to the country after the fighting ends?
Yeah, it's a great question. Carol, hello again. Again, I adore you. Carol is a wonderful person and a great scholar. So the interesting thing about this refugee crisis, and I myself was a Ukrainian refugee. I was inscribed in the UN thing on March 8th. They gave me warm tea. The Romanian volunteers gave me warm tea and shawarma after I stood online in the cold under the snow for 6 hours. I had warm shawarma. I had my last birthday in a Romanian Ukrainian refugee camp on the border, eating warm shawarma in a Red Cross ambulance. And I was thinking, what am I doing in my life? Myself being a refugee, I went back. Less jocularly again. This refugee wave, 4 million refugees already in Europe, 8 million IDPs. They're mostly women and young men. I had so many contemptuous looks, rage-filled looks from women online because I'm a man of military age. I'm not going to explain to them that I'm an American. I was born in Uzbekistan. I don't need to explain to everyone online who I am. But they were looking at me like, why are you here when my brother is fighting or my husband isn't here? Most of them who are married will go back. Some young women who don't have kids will stay. And again, there are no men coming out because men 18 to 60 are not allowed out of the country. There are a limited amount of older men. I saw in the refugee camps when I visited those in Romania and those in Poland over the last month. Limited amount of old men and some small amount of people who have humanitarian visas. Mostly it's young women and their children. Mostly they have husbands. Mostly they will go back. They're already starting to go back to those areas of Kiev which have been freed. Some will stay. I myself know people who will stay. Probably 80 to 90% will go back, if I had to guess. And also one more thing about that: the soft power of the Ukrainians is based on the fact that this has been a very feminine refugee wave. Mostly young women, their girls, and some small boys. It's a very cute refugee wave. completely harmless. Usually refugee waves are full of young men who are survivors and who are hungry and engaging in activity that young men who are trying to survive engage in, which of course is unappealing to landed people. This is the history of the dynamic between landed people and moving people, tribes moving across borders. The Syrian refugees of 7 years ago, they were welcomed, but ultimately those diasporas changed European politics in all sorts of ways, which we don't need to talk about now. But that's not going to happen with this refugee wave. Not just because they're Christian or Jewish, and they're mostly young women, not young men. Not talk about race and all this and religion, but also because a lot of them, half of them are in Poland, and there's a historical connection between Poland and Ukraine. I was just I lost a tooth. I'm not going to say how, but I got my tooth knocked out a week ago in Ukraine. Without going into the specifics, and I went to the dentist in Warsaw, and I ran into a random Ukrainian that I knew from Kiev in the dentist's office. That's how many refugees there are Ukrainian refugees there are in Warsaw. I went to get my tooth put back in, and I ran into a refugee that I knew in the dentist's office, and another one in the elevator on the way down. And I met random people that I had known from various places of my Ukrainian life walking down the street. So basically, Warsaw is now a Ukrainian city. The Poles see the Ukrainians as fighting the Russians, so they don't have to. So they've opened up their houses. The Polish prime minister, when I interviewed him 9-10 days ago in Warsaw, told me every single Polish family has opened their house. This is absolutely true. This refugee wave is completely different from the one we saw in 2015 and 16. It will change European political life in all sorts of interesting ways, but not in bad ways, unlike the previous one. So,
a question from Danny Steinmetz. What have you observed within the organized Jewish community in terms of either identity or in terms of organization, disorganization? Also, thoughts on relationships to Israel.
Okay, Jewish community. This is a tough one. Let's start with Israel. The trope that one has heard from smart Ukrainians over the last years that we're going to be Israel now, we're going to have to be Sparta, is being voiced even by the Jewish president of Ukraine now, my friend Sam Sokol, who wrote a book about Putin and the Jews, in Ukrainian Jews, wrote an article today in Haaretz, a front page article about Zelensky saying, we're not going to be nice and liberal like the Western Europeans, we're going to be like Israel, right? Ukraine was going down a different developmental vector than the other Eastern Europeans in terms of the nationalist thing, vis-a-vis the Orbanist thing, and Western Europe really is different from Eastern Europe for all sorts of reasons. But Ukraine now will have to look more and more like Israel. Zelensky said this today. They're going to be, he said today, security is going to be the biggest issue in the country for the next 10 years. There are going to be guys with guns guarding you at the cinema and at the mall, just like in Israel. These are things that were said quietly. This is a trope that you've seen from Ukrainians for a long time. They understood this for a long time. Now this is well understood by everybody now. I think this is a universal understanding that Ukraine is now surrounded from two sides by unfriendly states. Its entire northern border is militarized, and its entire southern border with Russia is militarized. There's a Russian fleet on the Black Sea, and it has Russian bases in Transnistria and Moldova. So it like Israel, it is surrounded now by unfriendly states. Israel is less and less surrounded by unfriendly states. As Israel becomes less and less surrounded by unfriendly states, Ukraine will be more and more surrounded by unfriendly states unless something happens to President Putin, which is a different story. So let's skip the Jewish stuff for now. Let's just talk about maybe the war stuff. Yeah.
I guess that is it then. So in that case, I would like to thank Vlad once again for this fascinating talk and especially discussion. To hear from you, and we hope we keep hearing from you in the future.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for thank you for all of you for your attention. Last thoughts. I do think that that Russian studies, this is academia now, will be transformed and transmogrified by this for a long time to come. I'm writing now an op-ed with my friend, sociologist Marina Nahum-Sapritsky, Russian-American British sociologist who lives in London. We're writing an op-ed now about the way that this has transformed relations within the Russian diaspora. To find a time when the Russian diaspora has had polarization like this, you would have to go back to 1920, right? The people assassinating each other in Berlin in 1922, right? The Russian oligarchs who had been doing all sorts of things usefully, and sitting on two stools at the same time, they are now no longer capable of doing this. The large majority of and I do talk to Russian oligarchs. I actually texted Friedman. You have anything to say on the 25th? He didn't text me back. I mean, it's the only time he never texted me back. People like Friedman, people like Kahn, people like Avon, people in the diaspora who were billionaires and were doing tremendous things in terms of philanthropy and were not really trusted by either side, are all sanctioned now. The Russian diaspora world, from institutionally to the synagogues, to the churches, to philanthropy, to cultural organizations, are going to be transmogrified. You're going to have certainly the Russian Samovar is not going to be existing in a couple of months. I'm sorry to say I had my birthday there, but maybe they should rename themselves the Ukrainian Samovar, which I hope they will. But the oligarchy and the business community, including people in my own family and my own friends, are unspooling and unwinding their businesses in Russia. This is going to change the way that the Russian institutions are structured. It's also going to completely change the way that that Slavic studies is done. This is going to change the kinds of work that people work on. It's going to change the kinds of funding that you'll be able to get. It's going to transform, unless Putin leaves and things will be normalized, which could change everything, but let's not bank on that. This is the new normal. This is going to be fallout that we're going to see over this for the next 10 years, which is why I'm uncertain. I was uncertain coming here about the way that Bucha and Irpin has transmogrified the relations between the Russians and Ukrainians, which are obviously going to be horrific now, maybe non-existent. There's no going back from this. This is the new normal. This is forever. But lots of people in the diaspora, including family members of mine, are going to have to make decisions about whether they are Russians or Russophone post-Soviet people. Identity politics will change a lot. I burnt my Russian passport. I made a decision to join the Ukrainian political nation. I'm from the Russian-speaking diaspora. A lot of other people are going to have to make certain declarations and similar symbolic declarations and decisions, just as the Russian-speaking and Russian diaspora becomes much, much bigger, as hundreds of thousands, if not a million, Russians will leave Russia. So again, there's a lot there. We can unpack that. But thank you so much, Professor Bornstein, for having me.
Well, thank you for coming. It was really, really very helpful. Thank you. Thank you all for attending virtually and in person. We'll see you at our next event.